to The Movers with me, Sinead Gillett.
And I'm Philip Macartney. Now, Sinead, I'm a little bit pissed off at you. You went away last week. I wasn't invited. It looked like a good jolly. I thought we're not Bert and Ernie, but we do these jollies together. Why didn't I get to go? Where were you at?
Well, last Thursday, I was in Liverpool at our iCabbi Women in Taxi event, which is an event that I've hosted now twice in line with the International Women's Day, which was on Saturday the 8th, just gone.
Are you saying that I would have sort of stuck out like a sore thumb there, or maybe I wouldn't have been welcome? Like, what are you doing? What did you do at that event? What was it all about?
Well, first of all, you were not uninvited. And if you're a bit pissed off on not being there, you'll be even more pissed off to know that John, our producer, was there with me, not letting his hair down because he doesn't have any hair. Enjoying himself in only the way that John can. And other men were there also, but it was mostly a lot of ladies in a room, but also some men as well.
And you started this, didn't you? Is this your baby? Women in Taxi, it sounds like a fairly small group, but when you see the people that were there and stuff that you posted on social, it's getting really popular, isn't it? Like, there's quite a few women in the industry that are going now.
So this was only our second year doing Women in Taxi, but another very successful event, and we will definitely do it again next year. Last year it launched really just around the idea that I'd had that when I was out and about at lots of trade events and meeting our customers, I was encountering lots of women, but maybe not as many women as men, but lots of women who were really succeeding in their businesses, innovating, bringing new technology to the market, very entrepreneurial. And I wanted to celebrate that and give those ladies a space to recognize their achievements, and also to answer back to a couple of customers who had said that sometimes when they're at certain conferences, they feel like the representation of female leaders isn't quite there or isn't quite heard. Gave that a bit of a think, and we came up with Women in Taxi, which was a super event last year and again this year.
I love it. And that sort of leads us nicely, when you said about the underrepresentation, that kind of leads us nicely onto the topic for today, isn't it? And I think it's in some way in honour of National Women's Day or International Women's Day, and of the Women in Taxi thing that we got onto this. So tell us about this, because this is your theme. This is you. So tell me about it.
So there can be quite a divisive debate around International Women's Day. Whether we should or shouldn't celebrate it. Is every day a man's day and only this one day is International Women's Day? What is the purpose of it? Should we have women in? Should we have? I
like
women
that. Every day is 364 Men Day. I like that. That's a great way to go.
This is one big day. Should we have events that focus in on women in business, women in leadership, those kind of things? And I have always kind of been on the fence on these things. So 5 or 6 years ago, when I owned my own business, I would have attended a lot of female networking events, but also a ton of other networking events. I mean, I would have gone to anything. Every day was a sales day. So we went to lots of events and we did a lot of business that way. There was a lot of female leadership events and we did attend those. And some of them were brilliant and some of them I didn't really understand. So when it came to looking at doing something similar for the taxi industry, I knew that there was going to be people that would totally welcome this and other people who might be like, I don't get it. Why do we need to do this? Why are we separating out? Is that not the opposite of what we should be doing? So that actually did happen. I think the first one that we did, I did have one member of the team say, I asked her to do something at the event and she said, yeah, I'll do it. But by the way, I completely disagree with everything this event is going to do. I was like, oh shit. Pretty close to start time for that one. So look, I kind of can understand a little bit, why are we even doing this? As we were coming up to the event there last week, I was reading around this area, looking at different opinions on it, looking at kind of different studies into gender equality, gender neutrality, gender segmentation in different industries. And what I came across, which was through the recommendation of a friend of mine, which was through the recommendation of her husband, was a book called Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. And this book I absolutely devoured. And my friend Catherine had been saying, oh my God, John just will not shut up about this book. He is going on and on and on about it. And I'm now the new John, because I keep telling people about this book too and how much I got from this book.
So you've told me about this book and it's very interesting. We should go into it, because I thought, when I saw the title, I mean, I've got to admit, I sort of rolled my eyes and I was like, oh, this is another book that's just going to paint me and all of my male comrades to just be the most awful things that humanity has ever spat into existence. And we're terrible and women are great. And it wasn't at all. Like what you got from this was a clear understanding. This is why I think it was really well titled. Was a clear understanding of where thinking about women and women's specific needs is not there in some of the biggest business challenges, in some of the biggest civic challenges, societal challenges that we have. And to the point where when I learned about it from you, and we'll go into it in depth now, it was one of those I sort of get where your friend's husband had this sort of one of those jaw drop moments and go, why, what? Why didn't we think of that? It's crazy. And I have to say, like, when I first heard of it, I did go in with my own bike and I thought, please no, I get enough of this at home from a wife, a daughter, 3 sisters. I can't take any more, please. I have a very positive feminist attitude, but this was a really interesting take on a problem that I don't think a lot of people know about.
So as I was reading the book, there were lots of areas that I had heard of before, come across nuggets of information, but the overall picture that Perez presents, which is around the gender bias in many areas of society, economics, corporate worlds, the workplace, all these different areas, is presented in relation to data. So she speaks about the gender data gap, or the lack of data that looks into sex deaggregated data. So we may record data on many areas, but if we don't break it down by looking specifically at male and female perspectives, then we are missing certain problems that may be in there that relate to female perspectives. And when you don't know what the problem is, you can't solve for that problem.
Yeah, it's if there's no data, the insight, if there's data missing, the insight is always going to be wrong. And I think you said to me something about it's not from some evil mustache twiddling point of view where people are cutting these things out and trying to do badly by women. It's that if you don't have that data, if you don't have that perspective, your insight is always going to be skewed. It's always going to be missing the right way of looking at it.
Yeah, we can be a bit kinder to ourselves when it comes to bias, because the nature of bias is that it is implicit. It's not something that we are walking around knowing what our biases are. It's something that's inherent within us and that we've kind of grown up with. They're built into our systems. They're built into the programs that we've used to build the worlds around us. They're historical. They're traditional. They're just things that are with us. And unless you start to really look for biases, you won't know that they're there. And the point she is making is that we should be looking for biases, not that bias is there because of any malicious intent. This isn't men domineering over women and keeping the women down. This is simply, that's just the way it's always been. And that's what she's raising awareness of here in this book and pointing to. And that's what I find really interesting, and why I kind of enjoyed her book, because it takes that debate, I guess, that sometimes pops up around International Women's Day. I mean, obviously it pops up other times, but it does surface in the media around this time of the year, away from this equality, women's rights, and brings it into something that's actually much, much deeper than that, because you can have the legal issue around women's rights, which can be very specific about how things are worded and policies around that. And then you just have the culture and the systemic traditions that are in place that are putting women in a world that hasn't really been designed for them. And that's what I find very interesting about this book. So the 3 core areas that she focuses her attention on in this book are 3 tropes that relate directly to the female experience of the world. And they are the female body, the unpaid care burden, and the issue around sexual violence towards women. They're the areas that I'd like to talk about in this podcast. And while her book is very much broad, the entire world, as I said, the workplace, we're going to talk specifically around transportation design.
Okay, so let's start with the first one. I feel slightly weird saying this. Let's start with female bodies. But, let's start with this one, because the example on this was actually shocking to me. Let's hear about this.
It's probably a good place to start, because when you look into this is the gasp moment of like, what? This is outrageous, and how can we let this be? So one gender bias that exists in the design of transportation is the fact that, drum roll, a woman
I'm not doing the drum roll, but carry on.
Okay. A woman is 73% more likely to be injured in a car crash than a man.
73%, Sinead. This is crazy. Okay, take us into the why.
I'll pare it back. First of all, men are more likely to be in a car crash when they're driving. But that's probably a podcast in and of itself, okay, which is around male driving behaviours and
Well,
danger.
I'm a perfect driver, so we don't need to get into that. Or maybe I can
And
stand
look, we have autonomous cars coming down the road. That's going to solve that particular gender issue there. But when it is a man and a woman in the same amount of car crashes, a woman will be 73% more likely to be injured, 47% more likely to be seriously injured, and 73% more likely to be injured. 17% more likely to die. Why?
And what's the reason?
The reason is very simple. Car safety tests are based on male crash dummies.
Like the crash test dummies, the cartoon or whatever you used to see all the time, right? It's literally they don't build female versions of that. Or maybe they do now, but they haven't for the past 100 years of car manufacture or however long it is.
So where
Only
we see
males.
gender bias, as we said, it's not necessarily something that is done on purpose, but there has, for however long history has gone back, there has been this idea of the male, the default male as being one with man. So human is man. That's the default. Let's design the world around the man. So when it came to creating a crash test dummy, that was designed around a white man around the 50th percentile, which is about...
Hold on. We don't, why do we know it's a white man? That's just because he's white and then has that weird black and yellow sign on the side of his head. How do we know he's white? Because I know this because it's based on height and size and average weight and stuff, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, so it's about 1.7 meters and about 78 kilos or something is the average white male, 50th percentile. So that is what the standard crash dummy has been designed for. And that has been used to test seatbelt safety. And when the introduction of airbags came in, how airbags were designed and tested for too. So when you put a male crash dummy into a car and test it, it's not representing many people who will also be in the car. So we've got the female driver who, by virtue of being female, is likely to be shorter than the 50th percentile male, is going to have the car closer to the wheel. So they're already in a different position than that 50th percentile male when they're using the seatbelt and when the airbag is going to be working for them.
Yeah.
So it's a big issue.
A different physical shape altogether. More than likely narrower shoulders and less muscle mass in the shoulders. Obviously in the chest, different build there. Hips potentially wider, smaller, whatever way, depending on there's a huge amount of variances there that mean, again, I'm thinking of this as a dad and a brother and a husband. These change completely the dynamics of a crash, don't they? Because when you add it all together.
When you add it all together, it makes that statistic that I just mentioned, 73% more likely to be injured in a car crash. You're also much more likely to be trapped in a vehicle as a woman too. And again, that's around the testing of dummies when the car is smashed in. And people are aware of this. So it's not that the world doesn't realise that the male crash dummy is being used and is the predominant regulatory standard that has been brought to people's attention. But even when it has happened, so in 2011 in the US, this became mandatory. Let's talk about female crash dummies. They did that, but all they did was shrink the crash dummy. So they made a smaller version of the crash dummy, but that doesn't account for differences in the anatomy of a female. So for example, we talked about bigger shoulders, but a man typically has 75% more upper body strength. They have different muscular mass in their shoulders and their neck, the backs of their legs. And so this makes a really big difference when there is a rear collision. If a crash test dummy doesn't have the female version of the body, then they're not really testing for what happens in that case, even when the dummy is a smaller size. And what we see is that a woman is about 3 times more likely to suffer from whiplash. And that's because the seat isn't designed to protect a woman. So we know this, but yet still seats in vehicles haven't been designed to help a female to withstand whiplash more than a man.
And if you roll that up, so that probably is not just from a manufacturing point of view, but that's probably also the parameters of the testing. So everyone wants their 5-star safety, et cetera, et cetera. So then you have to go back and repurpose all of those international safety rules to be in order to do that. And I think I'm not saying it's a rigged game, but I think it's a much wider conversation than one manufacturer just taking it on. But the other thing on this, and I know you hate me going uber commercial on these things. The other thing about this is that they market certain cars specifically to females. You can see it in the ads, the cute little Fiat 500 or the cute little Ford car, whatever it is. It is beyond me from a commercial point of view how no one has taken this up and said, why don't we do absolutely everything from a female perspective on this vehicle? We'll do all of the crash test dummies. We'll create a safety cell that is specific for female drivers and female passengers. Like to be completely callous, I'm looking at this going, there is a massive opportunity there for the OEMs to completely change how they look at this and create a genuinely more safe vehicle for females. So anyway, I think it's crazy. Let's move on to the second one, Shin. What's the second one now?
But
I'm going to get angry now.
Just to go on to the design, because I know I'm going to kind of go off script a little bit here. Not that we have ever a script, but off
How dare you?
I suppose,
we do
off
have
in
it's
a different
very
direction.
tight.
Some of the other examples around the design of products and how there's a gender bias attached to those, almost mind-boggling, some of the other things that I read about in this book or that I've come across since reading this book and looked for other examples of it. So can I give you a couple of them, because they are kind of crazy. Especially, you did mention the white male default there a minute ago when you were putting that back.
Well, be careful, because I'm getting angry now. So yes, so let's
Okay.
do it briefly. What are the other ones?
Okay, so PP. You know,
PPE? I thought you said PP there, and I was like, well, yes, we PP differently.
Protective equipment, right? Which is a legal obligation for employers to provide for their employees. I'll leave that one there with the legal side of things. So, you know those dust goggle things that you get? You might get them for working as a decorator, or you might use them for like mowing the grass. You know those things. They have been designed for the male default. Your man, whoever he is, okay?
Easy.
They've been designed
Easy.
for him. So they don't fit female faces. So they're unsafe for females to wear those. Not for all females, but for many females, they don't fit them. But they also don't fit black men's skulls correctly, or Asian men's. So there is a white man thing going on here, as well as a man-woman thing too. So that's one example that I think is terrible. But sorry, not that it's funny. I'm sure that's the injuries have been caused by that. But there are deadlier examples too. So the defence forces, they actually really suffer from gender bias in their PPE. And a recent survey done of women in the defence forces and emergency services in the UK showed that only 5% of women were satisfied with the PPE that they had. And I think what happens is employers understand we have a legal requirement to provide PPE. Sure, isn't it enough to give everybody one standard set of PPE? Or aren't we being really proactive by getting PPE in smaller sizes? But like the example of the goggles there, it's not just about the smaller size, it's about the way it fits the female form and the female body. So,
well, do you know, when you first said that about, PPE and other elements of PPE not fitting, there's a facetious joke that you could go into and say, what did the woman want a different color? But I'll tell you what, after watching the amount of nurses, female doctors that suffered and died during COVID because they were working so closely.
But let me just talk about the stab vests, because this one really annoys me. Stab vests are
Sinead,
not designed for boobs. There's no boobs in stab vests, so women police officers don't wear them. And people have died by being stabbed because their boobs didn't fit into the stab vest. And other women have had to have reduction surgery to have the same level of equipment protection in the workplace as their male colleagues.
Okay, you're getting militant and I need to move on. We've a time limit here, Sinead. Okay, number 2. Give me number 2.
Number 2 is around unpaid care burden, unpaid care work. So that is basically childcare, housework, homemaking, elder care, all the stuff that people do that they don't get paid a wage for.
Okay, and
women do 75% of the world's unpaid work.
And how do we link this to mobility then? Because you had a good example of this, right?
I do. So women do 75% of the world's unpaid work. And that means that women, it means lots of things. But in this particular instance that we're talking about, it relates to how women use transportation and their transportation needs and how that can differ than the typical man.
I know this. I have a new word. Actually, it's 2 words. I have a new phrase. Can I teach you my new phrase?
Yes.
Are you sure? Because you're looking at me and you're rolling your eyes. But okay, I'll teach you.
You can teach me
new phrase.
What I taught you.
I'll try, but you'll argue with me and go, you're wrong. So this new phrase is called trip chaining. So this is about how more women would have multiple errands in a single journey. So, for example, the drop kids at school, commuting to work, or go to grocery shopping, visit someone, etc., etc. But traditional transport planning is based around the typical movements of what would be considered more male activities. So, as you say, there's a lot of the majority of females do the unpaid work, which is, going to get the shopping, looking after kids, etc. I think the current transport system is set up for the commuting male, right, or predominantly what was seen as a commuting male. And we can talk about the sexual problems and stuff on public transport in a second, but it's man gets up, man goes to work on the train, man finishes at 5, man comes back. It's a linear journey. It's not a multi-stop journey, and it's not built for that. So trip chaining. What do you think of trip chaining? Did I get it right, teacher?
Yeah, sort of.
What do you mean,
So let's scroll back a bit. You kind of, but
being back in school again.
So across Europe, 2/3 of public transport users and pedestrians are women. That's pretty standard statistic across Europe. And we see that in some of the US cities as well. But how women use transport is different to how men use transport in many cases, like what you've just described there. But what you just described there failed to bring in the fact that a lot of the women who are trip chaining, they're also on their way to work. So we're not just talking here that women are at home and men are going to work. That's really not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the additional burden that more women do compared to men that relates to the house as well. So even in dual income families, the woman typically still does 3 times more unpaid work than the man for many reasons, but that's the case. So the way a female needs to use the transportation systems, which is the pathways, the roads, the rails, the buses, can be a little bit different to how the traditional view of a commuting male used the transportation system. And remember that we're talking back to the design of these systems. So this is the traditional design spec, and this was done by men. So the men who built the transportation systems over the last 100 years tended to be the men who were traveling into their office to design transportation at peak hours. They're the breadwinner in their families. Their home was their home where leisure took place. Their work was their work where work took place. They were a classic commuter. And so our transportation systems have been built around that particular model. And it's no longer relevant as the suburbs have gotten broader and broader, as more women are in the workplace. The needs of our society have completely changed, and that hasn't been reflected in how our transportation systems are answering back to that.
The Movers podcast is brought to you by Moovex, the most advanced route optimization platform available today. Go to Moovex.ai. That's Moovex.ai.
Okay, so that's the problem, Shin. So are there any examples of doing that right? Is there any examples of this actually working somewhere, or have you seen something?
So the first thing is to look for it in the first place. So city planners, they don't always look for sex deaggregated data to try and understand how the city is moving, who is moving where, why and how, and what they specifically need. So the first thing is to understand the differences between how men and women navigate their cities and towns, and then to look at how things can be improved in order to support that. So if you take, for example, this basis for building out our transportation systems, which has often been done around critical mass, right? So we look at the peak capacity and we build around that. Yes, we need transportation between certain hours because there's a huge amount of people traveling to the one place at the one time. The city is breathing in the workers and then breathing them back out again at the end of the day. But for the rest of the day, there's many other people doing different types of transport needs that also need to be catered for. And that's not always the case. So it's about making sure that our cities are answering to everybody's needs. And when it comes to the traditional design, we're talking about a very radial kind of design. So you've got all these lines running into the center and maybe a little bit of a circular thing going around there, a bit of a spider web, but you don't have connection between different suburbs. And that is not suitable for a person who needs to bring someone to a clinic that's in the next suburb over, or to a school that's in the next suburb over. It doesn't really work. So we need to focus on fixing things like that. Very difficult to do with the rail networks or with subways because they're very infrastructural. They're deep rooted. Buses, much more flexible, There's a lot we can do there. Swapping over to grid systems, for example, is really useful, and we're seeing that in different cities around. And I think that's a really, really good place to start.
This is where, so we do an awful lot of work with partners in the mass mobility as a service sector. I think this is where something, some of these mass apps that go across many different travel types. So train, they link it to train, to taxi, to bus, to whatever else. I think the data that we could take from that, because it will actually, from the sign up data, you'll know the male, female, age, possibly where they live, etc. And then you'd be able to see the travel patterns across different transport types and actually monitor what they need to do and if there's a better way of doing it. I think this is where, those sort of apps may become useful for local governments and local authorities to really try and understand these travel patterns, because otherwise they're going to be challenged with what they currently have in their infrastructure, right? They're not going to understand what you're explaining to them, or they're not going to have the tools to do it.
They could. It's just a case of making it a point of fact that they need data. Fact, we need data to design our cities and towns. Let's do it. It's not that they don't have it. They just aren't looking for it. Sorry, and that's not true of all city planners at all. There's plenty of really positive approaches out there. Let me give you an example of some positive gender planning in urban design. This one comes from Sweden, town there in 2011. They were going through a gender planning rehaul, looking at different areas of their city, identifying where the usage was taking place and trying to understand, was there biases towards male versus female travel patterns. One area that came under scrutiny was how they organised their snow ploughing. So we're in Sweden, a lot of snow during the winter time for months and months and months. And like many towns, the snow planning followed a very simple formula, which is you look after the main arteries first and you end up with the pavements and the cycle lanes. So you prioritise the people, and as we know, the men mostly driving to work on the main arteries, and then you work your way back and you look after everyone else who's on the pavements. But we know that roughly 60% of the people who are walking are female. They're trip chaining, as we've just talked about. They're probably pushing buggies. Some of them are on bikes. And so when they looked at the strategy that they had put in place for years and years, they realized that it actually discriminated towards women in particular. And so proactively, they changed how they approached snow ploughing. They actually went with the pavements, cycle paths first, and then moved their way backwards towards those main arteries, therefore allowing the people who are getting to work, and let's face it, getting to work by walking, by using public transport, much harder to do in the snow than it is to drive a car in 3 centimetres of snow. So actually they were putting, the burden of the snow was with the people who were walking, taking public transport, not really on the drivers. And so they prioritised those. Fairer, more equitable and nicer for everyone. But what they didn't plan for was how much money it ended up saving the city. 3 times more accidents coming into A&E during snow times were coming from pedestrians slipping on icy paths. And when they went and prioritised the snow clearing on those paths first, that reduced that down dramatically, saving the city millions every year. Prior to this strategy, it was costing about 3 times more than the cost it would do to snowplow to service the healthcare needs of the people that were slipping. And that just completely dropped down. City was making more money, transport was fair. And they're the kind of policies that we should be looking at and sharing. But if you don't look for it, you can't solve for it. You don't even know what the problem is. And the problem right now is the lack of data being collected.
Okay.
It's not that they don't have access to tech companies to give them that data. They could just go and find it themselves.
Okay, Shin, let's move on to the third point now. So tell me a little bit about this. This gets very serious now.
Okay, so male violence against women is another area where gender bias in our planning can occur.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not even just violence, it's actually violence and harassment. I think you could put harassment into this bucket as well, couldn't you?
I think so, yeah. There's a spectrum there where you've got your basic harassment all the way up to obviously very, very severe crimes. When we apply this one to public transport, this is an area where certainly I have felt unsafe before. I would say that is very common amongst women and also men too. Public spaces can be intimidating, particularly late, dark, when they're empty. And when we look at how transportation designers approach that, there's definitely areas that need to be improved on in this particular space for sure. And I think it really is not just around reducing crime or attacks towards women, but it's about making people feel safe so that their experience traveling around a city is a positive one.
I love that. Like, so I'm a big hulking brute of a man, so I never really feel that unsafe in
We're afraid
most
of you.
situations, except for when I go to Sinead's house. So in order to empathize with that, it's always a challenge. And I heard a great thing. I'm fairly sure it was on the David McWilliams podcast, but I heard a great thing where a woman said to a guy, okay, so do you want to feel like what it's like to be a woman walking the streets or getting public transport late at night? She said, take out £10,000 in cash and put that in your pocket so that it's actually visible, and walk down that street and tell me how you feel. And the guy said, God, well, I think about it that way. It's like, do people know I have this? Can they see this? Who are they? Who are the footsteps behind? And it completely changed, not their attitude. Their attitude was always a good one, but how they empathized. It was like that sort of holding on to something that valuable and knowing that it could be attacked or stolen was just a snippet of trying to get the empathizing with that dilemma. You know,
it's the fear factor.
It's the fear of, because
Yeah.
you said it there. It's like, it's not just about preventing crime. It's taking away the fear, taking away the potential for harassment. And it's allowing women to travel the same way I do, because I don't travel with that fear most of the time.
Right, so it's the fear factor, and the statistic around that one is roughly 60%. Women are 60% more likely to feel fear in a public space than a man is. And it's the feeling of the fear that the problem is here.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's the crime reports. But statistics in this particular area are tricky to navigate, because a lot of the time when we talk about crime, we are relying on statistics about reported crime. So not all
That's
crime
right.
is reported. When it comes to particularly sexual harassment, that is really something that goes underreported. And when you actually then go and look to explore the underreporting of sexual harassment is when you actually uncover the levels of harassment that are there. There is studies that have looked at sexual harassment on the London Underground, for example, that have asked women on the London Underground, have you experienced this? And 1 out of 5 women say that they have. But there certainly is nowhere near 1 out of 5 are women reporting this into any kind of, I don't know, whoever they are, who looks after it. I don't even know. So it's the underreporting here, I think, that is really the problem. In Mexico City, 9 out of 10 women have experienced sexual harassment or violence. Like, that's 90%. 90% of women in Mexico City, when they leave their house and use public transport, are getting harassed.
That's great. And I'll throw a stat back at you. 88% of commuters in Nairobi have witnessed gender-based harassment. There you go. Just a random stat that I have to hand. So I used to live in London, so I know the tube. And it is an incredibly, if you get that 7:30 a.m. tube from Clapham, there is no room, especially guy my size getting on there, never too happy to see me. It's an incredibly challenging environment. And you're rammed together in that tube. You're completely touching everything about you. And it's a very difficult environment to be in for more than 20 minutes. I'm thinking of a secondary result that if someone did feel uncomfortable in the tube, or God forbid something happened to them, having to get on that transport again, like that must be super triggering. It must be an awful experience. That provider now has a customer that hates using their transport because of one bad incident. Do you know what I mean? It amplifies how bad you feel when you're on a packed tube. Maybe not so much on a bus where you've got a bit more air about you, but on the tube, it's an awful thing. So all those feelings and fears and stuff would be amplified.
And it's not just about being pushed up against people on a tube, which could nearly be used as an excuse in some cases for a bit of a grope and a feel, which is certainly what
Speak
people
for
are
yourself,
reporting.
Sinead. Is that what you said to the judge, is it?
Absolutely not. It's other areas. And I think this is what plays into the fear factor. It's not this necessary physical attack that's going to take place. There's a whole spectrum of harassing behaviour that can happen to a person when they're travelling in public transport. Anything from that staring thing to the... I think if the ladies listening will know what I'm talking about, especially when you're travelling in Europe.
What is that?
That's a thing.
What the hell is that?
That's a thing.
I hope the microphone picked that up.
That happens when you're out and about.
No, it doesn't. No,
it does.
What are you talking about?
It just might not happen when you're around. That is also something people say, there's no way this is happening. I've never seen this. It doesn't always happen when there's loads of other men around. And that's what makes it even more intimidating, is because it often happens in the quieter times too. So that's much scarier. So whatever about being on a busy train, being in a particularly one that is on a direct line that can only stop at A and B and nothing in between can prevent anything happening on that carriage in between because there's no one else on it with you. That's the particularly scary part. And the fact that we don't really look for this data, we're not going around asking everybody to please fill out this survey once a month on how you experience public transport. But often we're not even advising on what you should do if something does happen on a train. So obviously a little bit of a pss, 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 you're probably not going to go and ring the police. But we still have no idea how many women are being impacted, even at a very light level, for harassment, which can scale up and can affect that experience. You know, when you're on the train in the UK, and for very important reasons, they have those announcements around suspicious activity for terrorism. Have you ever heard an announcement on public transport about not accepting sexual harassment?
Not accepting creeps. Actually,
have you ever seen the signs on a train, which we have here? Seats are not for feet.
Yeah, I know. And
yeah, what about
trains?
Trains are not for masturbation.
I mean, you'd think that's a societal given.
You would think so.
Just a shout out to I saw a video there the other day of a guy chasing down another fella who had sexually assaulted a woman, like groped her, felt her up on the tube in London. And this absolute hero ran outside the tube station and grabbed the guy and trailed him back in and basically pinned him up against the wall until the cops came. And the woman was so in shock. And she was there with her husband, and her husband was like just trying to look after her. And she was, the joy on her face whenever she got someone else, when someone else accosted the guy and went, no, he's not getting away with this. This is not on. So I was clapping that when I saw that. I love that. I love that when something crap like that happens, someone else steps in. But to your point, they shouldn't have to. You know, we should have a structure where this sort of stuff can't happen.
Absolutely. And look, that's heroic, and I'm sure she was very grateful, but there can be lots of mini heroic moments happening in the regulatory bodies and in our town planners as well that can really help with some of this. So a couple of things that are brilliant, very small changes on buses, for example, late night buses, this idea of request stops. So you can just get off the bus whenever you want after a certain time, because it's going to prevent you having to get off and walk very far away from home. That costs absolutely nothing. I think that's really great. That's definitely something I would have loved when I was back in my 20s, getting the bus home from town late at night. Really easy to implement, no cost to that. You know, when you're in a train station and you walk over the bridge and you're going from like one platform to the next platform, that's nearly always enclosed. So you're hidden. So we just changed those to transparent. They should be glass, so you can be seen. Better lighting, very easy. Moving bus stops to places that are more in the public eye. Again, I don't have the stat here, but you're more likely to be attacked on your way to and from public transport than on the actual, on the train or on the bus.
That point's brilliant, because this is where there's a company that we're working with called SafeCab. And, you know, they've got a brilliant infrastructure for females riding in taxis where they can, both the driver and the passenger can effectively choose, you know, well, I'm a female driver, so I want a female passenger and vice versa. But also, and I thought this was a fantastic idea, on their app, they have a thing that allows them, passenger, to have effectively an SOS button until they get in the house. So if you imagine, so their details are with the cab driver and the dispatch, so we know who it is, and they can hit that button and it can effectively show the police where they are and call the cops right away.
Yeah, that's very reassuring, especially being dropped off maybe at a big apartment complex or somewhere that's you're walking in through a gate and then you're trying to get to your front door. And because that thing of holding your keys in your hands when you get to your front door, pretending to be on the phone, like that's a real thing that we do.
It's a real thing. And
real thing.
I love that they've seen that. That's, you know, those guys that made SafeCab are fantastic because they've seen that.
And there's lots of technology out there that can really support on that when you're talking about your taxi, your ride hail. It's brilliant, and it's making things a lot safer for drivers too. And we'll probably have a whole podcast in driver safety. But we do need to remember that not everybody is able to use taxi and ride hail. That's a privilege. There's a cost to that. Some people are public transport hostages or captives, whatever you want to call it. And so we need to make sure that the cities that we live in are planned for safety, for accessibility, and for everybody, not just for your man, as we call him.
On that note, Shin, I thought this was a really good subject, and I thought we've really got into some really interesting stuff there. And the fact that we can raise those points so well through the mobility sector is fantastic. So I forgive you now for not inviting me to the Women in Taxi event, but I think I want to go next year.
I think you might have been invited. I think I sent out an invite to that, but I'll forgive you for
I'm going
not
next
attending.
year. I'm going next year. That's it. Well, thank you very much, Sinead. Thanks, everybody. And thanks to our wonderful producers. And thanks to our sponsors, Moovex.